I want to say a word about myself so you can understand why I'm talking the way I am. I went to Caltech to study physics because I had heard in high school that physicists understood how the world was really put together. And I was really curious and wanted to know. And of course, over the first 4 years I was there, I learned that what they meant by understanding the world was not really understanding the world in its full sense. So by my senior year, I realized I was much more interested in the personalities of people like Dick Feynman and Murray Gell-Mann and others that were there. And so Oppenheimer talked me into going to Berkeley and getting a PhD in psychology, developmental psychology. So I did that. But you could see there was already a trajectory. So I went to Harvard in cognitive studies, which was really interesting because there are so many interesting people there. And from that, I ended up going to Mexico and studying psychoanalysis with Eric Fromm. And I've always kind of kept these things together. I think that they're not disparate. From physics, one of the great things, you learn two great things. One is when people say, oh, that's not scientific, they're probably wrong. And the other is the concept of field in physics, that is the idea that something is pervasive and everywhere and affects everything that's going on, is a really powerful intuition to use in the world. So with that background, I'm going to leap into these. This is a mural done in Siena. It's the doors of the council chamber, done in 1472 by Lorenzetti. And in the picture, especially on the right-hand side, is a painting of the town of Siena under good management. And you can't really see it, but the fields are plush. There's a wedding going on. The craftsmen are all building interesting things. The mayor is looking on with approval. On the wall that you can't see that would be to the left is the impact of bad government on the town, where the mayor is accepting a bribe, the craftspeople are drunk, the woman is a prostitute, and so on. So you think of this as a way of using graphics to enhance the quality of a decision-making space, because the members of the council have to walk past this to get into the council. And at Stanford, I started a thing with a colleague in archaeology called the Stanford Strategy Studio. And we took this as kind of a high-end goal of where we wanted to go to. We wanted to get away from the primary colors and the idea that creativity is a fourth-grade activity and move it to something much more dramatic and dynamic. If I can get this to work, there. In the Stanford Strategy Studio, we started with what does it take to have a real strategic conversation? And we said that to a group of executives that might come in there, I said, look, this is the stage set for the drama of a strategic conversation you're going to be in. And you're responsible for your self-presentation in the drama. Now, it turns out executives love that kind of language. And it hypes things up, and you have some accountability then around that energy. We used that space in many, many interesting ways to create a more intense kind of conversation. And just the kind of thing that we would do, well, the timeline that fell down this morning, my apologies, was a thing that we did in that room, and it starts in the Bronze Age and goes up to the present. And if you're talking to a group of people about banking reform, and this is in the room, they'll make many more historical references than if it wasn't there, even if we don't draw their attention to it. And in that in particular, in one group, they started out with, well, if the Bronze Age was that complicated, what we're doing now is just tweaking the system, which gave them permission to play in a way that you could not have done without that picture being there. We tend to fill up the space with all sorts of stuff, and then when a new group comes, we say, look, you can either take it down or you can put your stuff on top of it, but you've got to interact with it. And it turns out interacting with stuff like that from a previous group is very, very stimulating. So we started thinking of the artifacts of conversations and building it that way. Simple things that you could do, if I can get this thing to work right. You all recognize that. right? It's a description of the problems we're in many, many ways. If you then add to it the fact that the power of government to cope with the things that are happening is in decline or growing weaker over time, then what you see is that most of the conference in the last couple of days has been in this box. It's where the two are in trouble with each other and stuff is happening. And trying to figure out from there where to go in the future is a really different thing than if you say, let's also look back here at how we got into this mess. You find the conversation gets actually much more creative about future possibilities by getting that kind of resonance. People know it's there, but they haven't given themselves permission to integrate it into the conversation. Now, in this strategy center, we started working at Stanford with Paul Ehrlich and Don Kennedy on how to involve people from the humanities more in environmental discussions. And out of that, we discovered, first of all, people in the humanities and the social sciences package themselves so much in terms of specialties that the standard meme that you heard was, what could I possibly contribute? It's not my specialty. So it was very hard to recruit people into conversations. But at one time, a woman from the French department came, reluctantly, saying I couldn't contribute. And this was a finance discussion, and 20 minutes into it, you could see her body language start to change. And she's leaning forward, and she says, my specialty is the 19th century French novel. And guess what they're all about? They're all about markets and finance. And I have a lot to say about this. And she was just fabulous, and we loved it. One of the things that came out of this work was criticizing the standard way that scenario work gets done. Typically, scenarios are done like the runner at the block waiting for the gun to go off. It's all from the present, from your perspective, that way. Bang, and you go, and you're off into the future. A very, very different image of future thinking is sitting on a surfboard, feeling a wave come, and you go up with it, and then it goes down. And you look back, and you see the next one coming, and you decide to let it go, and you see where it goes. So what you're doing is building up an intuition for how these waves develop and where they're going. And you can do that in a planning exercise as well, by getting people to feel how it is like to be in the field of forces without starting just right now going forward. Got too many pieces of stuff up here. That work led me to question the people on the climate side at Stanford who seemed to me to be very naive about economics, generally. And in particular, they tended to want to blame consumers on the stability behind the problem we had. Where it was obvious in interviews that most people's consumption is tactical, much of it around their job and where they're sending their kids to school. And they would change it very quickly if they could. The real resistance comes in their fear about losing their jobs, that is, losing the income that they then use for consumption. And if you don't provide people with some alternative image of how they could survive in a transforming economy towards sustainability, they're going to resist you. And the way I've put it is, you can't blame somebody for not stepping out of a leaky canoe if you don't offer them another canoe. It's not crazy, and we needed to have more compassion about that. Well, I realized I needed to know more about economics, so I called up Rob Johnson, who was head of INET, and said, I want to learn more about economics. And he said, well, read the papers from our last conference. So there were 38 papers from the conference that had been in Cambridge, and I read them all and realized that very few of them even came close to the goals of the Institute. They were way too conservative. So I thought, I'm a psychoanalyst, I can figure this out. So look, they're all famous. You put them in a room together, they get rather self-conscious and cautious in their self-presentation. So we thought of how to loosen that up. So I took the following technique. Take each paper, like paper number 3. Let's get this here. And drew a big circle. And in the circle went the concepts that were used in that paper. Outside the circle went the concepts they did not use, like poverty, war. You could come up with your own list. And we did this for all the papers, and we had them on 4-by-6-foot sheets at Bretton Woods for the next conference. And it's amazing, because if you look at 2 or 3 of them, you understand with no explanation what's going on here. That the circle is self-imposed on the way you're writing and thinking. So it loosened up the presentations at that conference. So we agreed that I would continue working with them on issues like that, that is how to have more intelligent adult conversations and how to think a little more strategically outside the box. So that's what I do. My job is to keep thinking about what we're not thinking about yet and figuring out how to get a conversation going around that. Now, complexity. Complexity, to me, is an invitation to rethink the way we thought about the world under old-style physics. Old-style physics does the remarkable thing of, I'm going to have fun drawing this, but I probably don't have the time, so that bear with me. If you have this, and you let that ball go, you know what's going to happen. That's classical physics in many, many ways. If you start making it messier, like putting in other balls hanging from other pieces of string, and you let this thing go, you no longer can predict what's going to happen. In standard science, that becomes uninteresting. But in fact, in real life, it's really interesting what happens when you have situations like that. And complexity theory has said, loosen up, rethink about these things. Loosen up is the way Brian Arthur, I think, is thinking about this a lot. Get out of the rigidities of the old kind of science. Not only is it an invitation to rethink what we did, but to take a look at things that we just totally ignored and begin to tell stories about them, because you can't calculate, but you can do stories. I'll come to the calculation problem in a moment. Now, part of what I want to talk about at this conference, which has to do with the governance side, is here's a certain permission to rethink things that's scary, because it says actually you have less control than you thought you had. So what do you do? So in that invitation, one of the problems is to abort the freedom that's been created by talking about complexity and try and turn it into a new orthodoxy. I'll come back to that too. If we look at some key books that have influenced me in the past, one is probably most of you have read Joseph Tainter's The Collapse of Complex Societies. If you haven't, it's really, really good. And in that book, Tainter talks about some things that the reviewers almost always miss. So, for example, he says, and the basic thesis of the book is, when the GDP of a country is going up, the infrastructure costs to support that GDP rise faster than the GDP itself. So as you get further out in time, you come to a point where your surplus is eaten up maintaining the system, and the system is still going, which means you're going to go into a deficit and collapse. But the really interesting thing he puts in there from a governance point of view is he said, look, throughout history, the elites have owned the infrastructure. And when the infrastructure gets into trouble, instead of looking to how to repair it or reinvent it or innovate, they look for how to cut costs and get money out and protect themselves. You can see that in societies around the world today, that that's what's happening. Now that kind of rethinking into complexity is the kind of thing I would hope that complexity thinking is encouraging people in governments to do. Another example is a book that's much less known, Stephen Toulmin's Cosmopolis. Stephen says in that book that it's the received opinion among historians and everybody else that the Enlightenment was a period of increased civility, travel became freer, there was more affluence, Europe was looking pretty nice. In fact, it's just totally not true. It was the French king, Henry IV, was assassinated. There was incredible climate problems in those decades, huge unemployment, civil disruption everywhere, and it was the end of the 30 Years' War. So Toulmin says, look what happened. In the previous generation, you had people like Shakespeare, Montaigne, Erasmus, talking about humanity and culture in very, very rich terms. But with the crisis, people like Descartes and Leibniz and Spinoza said, we're killing each other thinking about these things, especially the religious issues. So let's create a dialogue around a limited number of terms where we can stay civil with each other. And mathematics and the modern sense of the object and all that is what came out of that dialogue. And so Toulmin says, look, we're still stuck in that, as though we're in that crisis, and we're past it. We should go back to the previous generation of Erasmus, Shakespeare, Montaigne, and others, Rabelais, for example, and come forward with that agenda and talk in a much richer way about culture, society, and all that. So, in a way, that's what I'm going to do in my shockingly small number of minutes. There are three key ideas I want to put across and then a challenge. The three ideas are, I'll start this way. If you listen at this conference and in other places that we all go, how do we talk about people? We talk about them as they're almost interchangeable with cars, right? They're points in a system of forces that impact on them. But they have no content inside except maybe a few algorithms for the most enlightened, right? Or maybe they're programmed a little. But basically, they're just subject to the forces. That's the standard view. If we start including real people in the way we think formally about what we're doing, and as we actually bring it into our theories and into our discussions, what real people are like, suddenly the logic really shifts, because instead of trying to take something like traffic flows, water patterns, air pollution, the flow of dollars, all the things you could map out, and if you do that kind of map, the tendency is to want to make some kinds of efficiencies around those forces. That's the use of complexity in that sense. But if you put real people in there, you realize suddenly the logic changes, and the real thing to think about is what is the quality of life of the people, and the rest of the system becomes subordinate to that. That is a huge shift, and I wish we just were trying to make that everywhere. It makes life much more interesting, and it's going to make for much better governance. Because talking about people in the kind of condescending way we do is making them furious at us. I'll come back to more of that too. Okay, that leads to the second thing to want to include in our discussions, which is culture. There was an interesting, mostly culture is left out of this kind of conference. It's treated as though everybody in history, from cavemen to the current time, are basically like us in terms of character structure, in terms of the culture that we carry with us. Not true. The cultures are really different. I hinted out of this morning in the question about the commons. The reality is that farmers around the world who are rooted in traditional societies have extraordinarily strong culture about managing the commons and other things like that. Let me just jump in an interesting place. The word capitalism. The word capitalism comes from cap, head, baseball cap, kaput, what goes on top of a column or where the head of a nation is. That's the use of the word cap. How did it get there? It got there through Latin and Rome, where cattle were the main measure of wealth. So the thing to do, if you breed cattle, you get a new head, and it was the magic of that production of something that was beyond what you had is the origin of the idea of capitalism. Now, the interesting thing is that all traditional societies have rules about how you do that. So, for example, I can give you a goat, and you can eat it, or you can give it away. But you cannot breed it, because to breed it would be to destabilize the environment that you're all dependent upon. So these things become highly ritualized and complex, so they're, like the Bali situation, they're hard to see what underneath is actually going on. But they are strong rules. Well, as capitalism, as the idea of mobile capital, moved into the detritus from the Roman Empire and into the beginning of the Italian city-states, the rules got dropped. So it became something that was free private property. I'm going to go off on words for a bit. The word property that we all use all the time, but who questions where the hell it came from? It got to have come from somewhere. You know, the theory that John Locke had was God made it just that way, already done deal. The word property comes from the same root as proper. And what it meant was, what are the things that a nobleman has to have that are appropriate to show his rank in society? That was the proper stuff. So you had to have a horse, you had to have a small castle, or whatever it was. Property was a way to show status in society. Well, look where it's moved to now. You have funny things like private property, where private is from the Latin privatus, which is to take out of the public into the personal realm. So you have property, which is the sign of your status in the public, taken out and made into a private thing. Now, the reason these things are interesting is because if we're going to rethink the system, which I think we need to do, you can't do it if you don't know this kind of stuff. It's really important to know the history of these concepts. Okay, the third thing besides culture that I want to enter in here is thinking more about history. It's obviously in the timeline, but the logic of understanding history can be very enlightening. For example, in agricultural societies, elites needed agricultural workers. In industrial society, elites needed industrial workers. In a digital society, it's not at all clear what the elites need. And if you take things like the derivative markets and so on, where you can make money with nobody but a computer, and you begin to think about this in terms of jobs and the social contract, you can see why I think we're in the crisis that we're in. If you don't see that progression from ag to industry to the current situation, it's very hard to grasp the depth of the problem that we're facing right now, which is we don't know how to create anything like the number of jobs that we need. We need 25 million jobs in the U.S. just to kind of break even. And nobody has a plan as to where they're coming from. Conference in China saying in 15 years we have to create 500 million jobs. Wow. But where? Doing what? There's no job. I mean, I put the challenge almost this way. There's no job in the world being done today where there isn't somebody trying to figure out how to replace you with a program or a robot. It's very intense. My friends who are in Stanford law firms who are looking at the fact that they're not hiring interns anymore because it all can be done either by Indians or by robots with algorithms. It's a big deal what's going on. So with those three, one more point to add. In history, almost all societies use the same word to describe physical law as courtroom law, the word law. What that does is suggest that the courtroom law, the society-made law, has the same status as a natural law. It's God-given or natural given. In the complexity world today, you see the same struggle going on. People trying to claim that complexity theory and economics, for example, are about natural things. David Hume said that economics is about people with theories about theories. And we lose that by using the word law. How am I doing on time? 5? Terrific. There's so much to say about people. I'm going to pick up one piece. Which has to do with perception. The standard theory of perception in psychology, and we use it almost everywhere else in our society, is that light goes from the object to the eye, then complicated stuff goes on in the brain, and you see a wine glass. What it leaves out is the fact that for the eye to get there to be looking at the wine glass is already part of the process. That is, a lot of stuff went on here that got the eye to walk over here and look at this thing. What's interesting is in Chinese, you have that. It's an eye with feet. That is, the eye to see is you have to move the eye to get there, to see it. If you think of behavioral economics, it's the same thing. We get some student to sit on a chair, usually pretty uncomfortable, in front of a funny-looking machine in a pretty architecturally cold room, and we throw stuff at them and get them to react. What's left out is the much more interesting part from an economic and psychological point of view is how did they get to that room in the first place? Why are they there? What are they doing? What do they want? And you can see it throughout the whole of social science. It makes people passive, and it makes the outside world active. One of the places where this becomes really important is in the problem of meaning. And I wish I had more time to go into the psychology of all these things, like the shame that came up this morning and interesting questions like that. But people need to have meaning. One of the things, if you're a politician looking at your people, you've got to realize they are thinking as hard about their world as you are about yours. And they're doing it all the time. They're having imaginations, they're making judgments, they have a very complicated process going on. Now, what they want is a way of tying things together that makes sense. That's traditionally what religion is. The very word religion comes from religiare, that is to tie things together. Science in our time has taken a privileged position that it's not one of those, it's something new and different. But in fact, science is a way of tying things together. And a lot of the categories in science come out of the Christian tradition. And they have the sense of even that there's a direction in time and things like that are rather on the theological side. And if we could see that that science is also a religious-like activity, and every religion in the world has different things it tries to tie together, and that they're peers with each other, then we have the interesting possibility that in fact science could become a field of meaning that would be really satisfying to a lot of people if we let it evolve that way. It's got wonderful things, like a lot of good ethics, but it's got bad stuff like we heard some of this morning, and the drive for status and the conventionality. I mean, groupthink in science is unbelievably bad. And the institutional stuff is not very good. One last thing, I think, as I jump through, no, two, and I'll be done. Two's the magic number for people who want to finish. One is the issue of rationality. We hear a lot about rational and emotional, as though they're different things. They're not. If a person is hungry, is that rational or irrational? You know, we treat emotions as though they interfere with a rational process. What rational process? A rational process by itself, in the current meaning, is just a mechanical analog of something in the world. It has no energy of its own. It can't make any decisions. It can't do anything. If you think of rational with its root in ratio, which means balance, for the Greeks, it really means the use of the mind in the service of life. That's what rational is. We have moved so far away from that by having things that we think of as rational that are irrational, like weapons, whatever it would be. And being a lot clearer about the rich interplay between emotions and logical thinking would really do us a lot of good. And the reason, there are two more things I want to talk about, but I'm only going to do one. And this is the challenge. We have the danger of there arising a new orthodoxy which would be built around behavioral economics, complexity, game theory, network theory, neurology, and some stuff thrown in about evolution. Evolution, by the way, almost everybody thinks that evolution is a converging process. Not true. At any point in time, what evolution tells you is we have more possibilities than we had back further. And it's a divergent process. So you can't use it to justify your view of life as though that's where evolution wants to go. Evolution wants to ride over you and go on to somewhere else and have more fun. The idea that there's a new orthodoxy is motivated by the desire to maintain the infrastructure of academic careers, technical careers at government, military, corporations, and everywhere else like that. Because if we gave up on calculability, going back to Brian Arthur's Loosen Up, a lot of jobs are in trouble. We don't know what to do with them. We don't know what to do with our graduate students who would take Brian Arthur's view of life and treat it like this is a much better way to think. I think it's just a real problem that we've got to think about is this holding on to a mechanical view. There's a wonderful book by Philip Borowski called Machine Dreams, where he shows how things like game theory, control theory, and all that from the 30s were brought together by World War II. They were used very successfully and then held on to the grant process in the social sciences and economics after the war. And it's just a wonderful, wonderful thing to read, beautifully written. Anyway, I think there I'll stop, sir.
Thank you very much.
He's smiling. I must have done something.
So, questions, remarks? On this? Yes.
Could you say a bit more about this new orthodoxy?
Yeah.
I don't really understand what you mean.
Yeah. So did I.
Okay. If we look at economics, but in science generally, there's a strong bias towards quantification and numerology, one form or another, right? And Descartes' part of the problem, but he was an interesting guy. But he kind of what he thought took over, and people think that if it isn't mathematical, it isn't science. It isn't even real. I mean, I've heard people, it isn't real, you can't measure it. And we've built up careers around all sorts of things, from spreadsheets to very fast computers, that are calculating machines with the view that the world that counts is the world that can be pushed into that model. And our careers and educational system are built around a lot of that. So does that help?
What is then the orthodoxy? What does it mean?
Oh, the orthodoxy is there's a new group of disciplines which are put together in just such a way as to maintain calculability and not upset the career path. Okay, that's what I mean by orthodox.
That's it.
It's a great question.
Yeah, it's a beautiful question.
That's what my job with INET is. What's the alternative? Hey,
I understand it
yeah.
depends on it, and it's the wrong alternative.
No, it's really important. I mean, we really don't know. But thinking more seriously about real people, thinking about history, looking at art, all that stuff probably has some really good stuff in it. I mean, my view is at the political level, we heard this morning that if you try and plan too much, it hurts things, gets in the way. We have Hayek saying, that governments are terrible because they plan, but he didn't tell you that there are corporations today that are much larger than any government he talked about that do planning. Planning is a complicated thing. It can really mess things up. And my own view, which gets into the kind of recommendations, is running many parallel scenarios of a loose kind, narrative. If I tell you a narrative and you don't like a part of it, there could be other parts of my narrative that are wrong, but they didn't get your attention. But the part that did, now we can have a really interesting discussion. And to do that, to surface things, to bring them out, to think of, if you want to understand what's happening to people in some part of your jurisdiction, think of how a really good reporter would handle that rather than a contemporary sociologist.
Okay. That's an answer, isn't it?
No.
Oh.
No, I don't think, or maybe it's an answer, but I didn't get it.
It's really saying we've got to trust the humanities and history and anthropology. Archaeology, for example, I think is a wonderful piece of the way we need to be thinking about our society. And we just need to do that. We need to increase the range of our imagination and let up. I mean, we're in a terrible, terrible situation. And, you know, part of the discussion this morning about the politics of it all, ordinary people are pissed off at scientists. Not because they do science, but because they're part of an establishment of high-paid careers that are ruining their lives, right? And they're angry at anybody who's caught up in that. We've got to free science up, make it more relevant, more interesting.
Okay. Next one.
We do talk about nature sciences and social sciences. How about aesthetics in this all? What role do you think aesthetics could play, if I understand you correctly?
Well, I hope by showing that first picture you got a sense that I have something to think about that. I think the separation of stuff into aesthetics, ethics, other parts of law is a mistake. I think they should really be together. I've drafted a book called Garden World Politics. It's listed in the program. And in there, I'm really saying, since most people want to live in a balance between nature and civilization, why don't we use our wealth to go there? And where there is looking at every part of the environment from an economic, aesthetic, and play point of view, certainly from a climate point of view, and putting that together. I think aesthetics is really, really important. But I think it's badly named. Nobody can even pronounce it, you know. Not where you want to go.
On aesthetics.
Yeah.
Even the mathematics, what I learned is mathematics studies, it's about aesthetics.
Very true, and mathematics is elegant in some of it. A lot of it looks like just piles and piles of spreadsheets, not so interesting. But the problem with mathematics is when it totalizes and says this all aesthetics, anything beautiful has an underlying geometry to it. It was Plato's mistake.
Next one. Yes, please.
I guess this is kind of related to the earlier question about the role of education. One of the big takeaways, at least for myself this whole week, is that due to the fast pace of technological change, there seems to be a understandable premium on training the next generation of technologists to sort of keep up. So I was very interested in the earlier exchange.
Yeah, so let me come in right there. Look, I mean, in California, the political thing is we got to educate Hispanic kids to be Silicon Valley engineers. Look, those are the easiest jobs to export. They're the easiest jobs to simulate in computers. It's the wrong way to go. The only people who want lots of technical education are the corporations because it'll drive down the rates you have to pay for them. Right? I mean, the education we need is about the education of the world we're in and going towards. We need to be in a world where a major thing is going to be how we're compassionate about the people who are losing out as we go through the next transition. A lot of stuff like that. Community building. I mean, things like that are silly, like we have schools for young kids here, and 6 miles away we have a complex for retirees. They should be in the same place. We have too many young people without adults, too many adults without young people. Let's put them together. But it's the education to think that way rather than if you do this technical careering through high school, maybe even younger, that's going to be good for the economy and good for you. It just is false.
Have we ever had a period in which young people were educated in the way you're saying?
Well, there have always been some. I would love to see a book that took, well, for example, Maria Montessori, the Waldorf Method. If you ever get a chance to watch kids going through Waldorf, it's an amazing experience. You'd want to be there yourself. And the very, very best of English education. And to say nothing, the stuff in Germany. I wish I knew more about it because there were moments. Vienna. I mean, the people who came out of the Vienna educational system. They knew music, they knew math, they knew literature, they knew languages, just as a matter of course. The stuff is there to do it.
Okay. Yes, please.
So a couple comments and a couple questions, I guess. One is that the comment is I think that you mentioned capitalism. I think that your actual reference should be to capital. as capitalism is actually an invention of Karl Marx in the 19th century.
Right.
Now, when it comes to jobs, it turns out, as a semi-practicing labor economist, it actually is an old saw among kind of the non-professional economist class that say jobs are always going away, and that jobs are never going to come back, and that we're always going to be the great insecurity of the middle class. That
Okay, and always is not forever.
So, just as an example, I mean, what fraction of the U.S. labor force decides autonomously to change their job every year? And the answer is surprisingly high, and in the words of a famous Stanford professor, it's kind of astonishingly high. I think that's what Bob Hall called it. So, it's amazing that 1/4 of Americans change jobs every year. That's about 30 million people, which is about 3 million a month, which is about 100,000 a day. So I think that this whole idea that
Okay, look,
jobs are going to vanish,
if you're going to be
is very naive
quantitative about it,
Yeah.
then you got to be quantitative all the way.
Yeah.
And that is that the replacement jobs that we're getting are paying a lot less. There are fewer hours, and there are a lot fewer of them. And the condition has changed.
That's
Going
the
from
popular wisdom.
agriculture to industry.
I'm sorry, it's actually factually wrong. That's a popular conception, and it's wrong.
Well-
U.S. wages are not flat. U.S. wages are slowly increasing. Right?
What,
that's
the
data.
average?
Yeah, the average wages are slowly increasing.
And so if you have the high going up really fast and the lower going down slowly,
So now you're saying that
you get a higher average.
So now you're saying that the median is decreasing.
Sure, yeah.
The median is not decreasing. The median is also going up slowly.
The
We have
point
talked-
is that if we were really doing a workshop, this would be a great point to say, let's go look at the numbers and see. Look, so do I, so.
So we have here a different opinion on the facts.
Good.
I think you should both have a look in his computer.
Homeland Security beat me to it.
Okay, next one. Okay, yeah, please.
So I'm still kind of struggling with this idea of this narrative, whatever you call it, way of doing science, so to say. Not pinning things down, but keep them kind of floating. It kind of reminds me of Louis Borges, the Garden of Forking Paths. Is that the kind of thing you're meaning, that there are so many different ways that we have to explore things that we cannot nail them down? It's almost like Jan was always telling me about the Tao, or the Tao, whatever you want to call it. And so that you don't really pin things down, but you keep on walking around it, so to say, rather than fixing it. Is that what you're talking about?
Well, rather than fixing it, look, I think we don't know a lot about what's going to happen. And I would say that social policy that moves towards increased flexibility and not commitment to structural plans is going to be better for us.
Say it again. No, you were asking whether when we are arriving in all kind of complexity issues, and the world is nothing in it is simple anymore. And when we have these Peter Who's list of problems and dramas we've got to cope with, and then you are saying circle around it and play with it, play your games, and he is saying, but are you giving up science then, or something like that? Are you giving up hard science, the facts and figures, and the classical method of doing science, what brings us concrete plans and concrete pictures of what might be called the truth or whatsoever? Is that what you want to give up?
No.
And is this what you want to go to do, and is circling around and playing with the world and so on? That's your question. Eh? It's a terrific question anyhow, but it's...
Yeah, well, putting play in there is a certain rhetorical trivialization of what I said. I think one should be very serious at looking around, understanding what's happening to people. For example, during the height of the recession, a lot of people in Silicon Valley were saying, oh, it's just cyclical, it's going to come back. There's signs on store after store, closing, going out, inventory sale. They're not putting it together. We need to put it together. I have two neighbors whose rent has just gone up to more than their income. They have children in school, they have local jobs, they are totally panicked, no idea about where to go. I think it's being experientially compassionate about what's really happening to people, not panicking, but taking it really seriously, and then beginning to see that the things that people are suggesting as solutions might not be adding up very well. I don't know if that's helpful.
But that's it. So you're saying then there is such a lot of difficult problems which are people to have to deal with. Don't make the mistake that science or whatsoever will give you one, they give you one answer, but that won't work.
And I didn't use the word science at that
Okay.
point, because those are really technology and planning mechanisms. They're
Okay.
different than science.
Okay.
I'm going to say a word about science. The fact that if you study science, you know something really important, like why the roof doesn't fall down, how light gets around in the room, what this thing is doing. Oh, that's Wei Wu Wei, by the way. It's the Tao. Without doing, do.
Yeah.
And we heard Tao this morning from our leader, and I think it's a really interesting way to think about where to go. Science is great, but it can be misused, and especially it gets misused when it turns into a career. When I was in physics...
Say that again.
What did I say?
Science is misused, especially when it's going to career.
When it becomes part of careers.
Okay.
When I was a grad student in physics, I hate to tell you, in the early 60s, it felt like it was open. You could follow your ideas. Time was slow. NIH was giving things career development grants for 20 years so you could work things out. Now everything is so compressed. At Stanford, I think students are taught the world is an ensemble of problems, any one of which can be solved in 3 years with a grant. Right?
Okay.
That kind of mentality is getting us into trouble.
Okay.
That's what I mean.
Yeah, that's what you... Okay, thanks. Thanks a lot. I think we've got to come to an end. So once again, thank you very much.